Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Fishbowltales. This week, I'm going to be getting off on a little bit of a tangent. Let's head into the shop, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. This week's project was inspired by a viewer of the channel. He reached out to me and told me that he also owns a 3301 New Look bus, which is awesome because I didn't really know there were a whole lot of them out there. We got to chatting about transmission gearing, rear end gearing, tire size, things like that, and to be honest with you, those were all things that I hadn't really put a lot of thought into. I mean, I did when I was trying to decide which transmission to put in this bus in the first place, and I knew that the stock MT41 that came in this bus was a non-lockup converter, non-overdrive transmission. So when I was in the market for a transmission, I purchased a newer electronic Allison that is full-on 6-speed lockup converter, overdrive transmission, and I figured, okay, we'll leave it at that. That should be a huge improvement over what we previously had. What I didn't think about was what the rear end gearing in this bus actually was. Now there were two options from the factory. I believe there was a 5.1 axle ratio and maybe a high 4 point something axle ratio, which isn't really ideal for highway driving. And I figured that the transmission was going to make up for that. But in the case that it didn't, I also had a set of 12R22.5 tires that are brand new that have been sitting up on our pallet racking here in the shop for the better part of 2 years. And I figured that was the easy way to buy us a taller rear end gear, basically, to fudge it. What I didn't think about was that the wheel size was different from the 10R22.5 tires that are on the bus to the 12R22.5 tires. Now, the wheels that are on the bus currently, I believe they're maybe 7 inches wide, which is too narrow for a 12R22.5 tire. So that really got me thinking, how exactly do you skirt an issue like that? Now the easy answer would be to just purchase a set of the right size rims. Easier said than done, because this bus uses an old school GM 6-lug pattern, which is almost completely obsolete now except for some older military vehicles and heavy equipment from the 1960s and 70s. So, then what do you do? I've already spent money on a set of tires, and I assumed that they were going to fit this bus. Now we had purchased them with the intent of putting them on the correct bus. Unfortunately, things fell through way back when, and we ended up with the tires anyway. And I had every intention of putting them on this bus. And I still do. So I set out to try to figure out how to convert this bus from 6-lug to 10-lug so that we could open up our wheel options. Now you might say, wouldn't it be easier to just sell off the tires that you have and buy the right size tires and go on your merry way? Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't correct our low rear end gear issue. So I'm still in the market for an idea on how to convert this bus over to 10-lug. Now, I thought about this for a while, I did some research, and I thought maybe it would be easy to machine a wheel adapter for this bus. There's plenty of meat on the front spindles or on the front hubs to drill and tap them and basically add a wheel adapter in. But the bolt patterns are so close together that I don't think we could fit all the hardware in there safely to make it happen. And the same goes for the rear end, obviously. So the wheel adapter idea went out the window. And that got me thinking, are there buses from the 1960s, GM buses, that use a 10-lug hub front and rear that would actually fit this bus? So that put me down a giant rabbit hole of doing research and tearing the front of the bus apart and taking measurements of the spindle to try to figure out what we actually had. And lucky for me, I actually think that I've narrowed it down to the correct SAE standardized spindle size, which is great. Today, I'm going to be tearing apart the front corner of this bus to verify that everything is correct and that we can actually purchase something off the shelf that'll make it easy to convert this bus over to 10-lug. Because in my heart of hearts, I really want to put a set of aluminum Alcoas on this bus because I think it would look really, really nice. Is it overkill? Absolutely. Do I have enough clearance to run the 12R tire? Yes. I've already done the legwork on measuring all of that stuff. We just need to make everything work together. So I want to be straightforward right off the bat and let you guys know that I am no expert at jacking up and blocking a bus. So if there's anything you see in today's video that you don't agree with, please let me know down in the comments. So the first thing I'm going to do is air up the suspension. Now the first time I did this, I realized that I couldn't get the wheel off of the bus with the suspension all the way down. So I'm going to be proactive this time, air it up first, and then we'll work on jacking the bus up. Pull this out of the way. There we go. Oh, that's better. If you couldn't tell already, this is a pretty long, tedious process to get the bus up in the air. So there's an air line here that comes out of the first tank back here, and it's got a Schrader valve on it. I do have like a clip-on air fitting, but it likes to just go on there as soon as it sees pressure. It blows itself back off, and it's kind of dangerous. So I like to use this regular tire fill style one, but you have to hold it on there. Pain in the butt. So we have about 50 psi in the system right now. At about 90, this thing will start to rise up. It's a very interesting system because the front of the bus starts to come up first, and then the back will come up. Let's go see where we're at air pressure wise. A whopping 70 pounds. We're not getting anywhere quickly. Alright, that ought to be pretty close. So we are currently just over 90 psi in the air system. You can see the bus has gone up quite a ways. That'll make it a whole lot easier for us to get that front tire off of there. You can see that skirt is really the only thing that gets in the way. And right there, you can almost see daylight over the top of the tire. So that's perfect. That's right where we want it. So what you see in front of me is the inexpensive, do-it-yourself, let's get the wheels off of this bus kit. Now I bought this stuff all a while back, so it's been a while since I've used any of it. I'll start in the front. We've got some 4x6s that we're going to use to block the bus up, keep us safe, that way the weight is off of the jack, we've got everything fully supported. In the case that I do decide to leave it up on the jack, the blocking will act as safety if I'm working underneath the bus and it decides to do anything crazy. I also have a piece of 3/8 plate down there that I'm going to be using on top of the blocking just so the wood doesn't split. We don't put too much pressure down on it. We can kind of distribute the load a little more evenly. Over here we've got a 20-ton manual hydraulic jack. That thing is amazing because I've lifted this bus up before and I've lifted buses bigger than this up, and you almost don't have to put in any effort. You can just kind of pump it like you normally would and the thing will come right up off the ground. Right here we've also got a Harbor Freight truck specific socket set. So this has all of the common truck lug nut sockets, as well as the square drive socket for the Bud lug nuts in the back for the inner dual. And the crowning jewel of the whole setup is a 1-inch drive impact. Now this thing is not for the faint of heart. It's powerful and it takes 2 hands to operate. But it is worth the money. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're on the side of the road, you plug this bad boy right into the air tank on your bus, and you can almost do a full service job on any corner of this bus by yourself. I highly recommend that if you own a bus, that you also own the tools and you have the know-how to work on it yourself, because you're going to be money ahead in the long run. So down here under the bus, you can see that I still have everything in place from the last time I had this thing off the ground. So I've got two really good 4x6s down there, the best of the whole bunch that I have. I'm going to go ahead and jack it up right underneath that front axle and block it the rest of the way up, and then we'll get the wheel off of this thing. There we go. Just like that, it's already off the ground. So I'm going to go up a little higher with it. Then we'll put our secondary blocking underneath it. Right about there is good. Okay, and we should be more than solid right there. It's just barely touching, so I'm going to leave it up on the jack. I'm going to take the wheel off, and it should not go any farther than this point here. So I am completely aware that you are supposed to block the body up from the actual suspension of the bus, because if an airbag blows, it can kill you. That is the most dangerous part of working under a bus. I, in this instance, am not going to be working directly underneath the bus, so I'm not going to block the suspension up. Now I know that the airbags on this bus are in decent shape, so I'm not going to worry about it. That's a risk that I'm willing to take. Go ahead and flame me for it in the comments, but it's how I'm going to operate. Okay, it's just about time to try to get this wheel off of here. These lug nuts are 1.5 inch socket for this 1-inch drive impact. I've got the shop air run out here. This airline is just a little bit undersized for this operation, but it'll work. So let's get this thing off of here. Okay, let that hang there for a second. I am missing one more tool that I need to get this off of here, so let me run in the shop and grab that real quick, and I'll meet you back out here. So for this, I would recommend a good heavy-duty tire spoon. I do have one at home, but it's not here. So I'm going to use a long pry bar to push the wheel in. We're going to grab underneath it. We're going to go ahead and pull it out, just like that. Get it out of the way, and roll her on. Now that is incredibly difficult to do if you don't have something to wedge underneath the tire with, because you want to be able to pick it up off of the lugs, drag it out just enough so that you have clearance to roll it on out of the way. So the next step before we can get the hub off of this bus is to remove the brake drum. Now the brake drum uses these absolutely hateful flathead countersunk bolts, and these ones are in pretty terrible shape because they've been chiseled on and chiseled off, and they're pretty rounded over. So we'll try them with a screwdriver here real quick. Oh, that one came off good. Now I did reassemble this a few months back with the intention that it was going to come back apart, so nothing is like gorilla tight, nothing's torqued to spec. And when you guys get in here and see what the condition of the spindle nuts look like, you're just going to laugh, because somebody got after it aggressively with a chisel and they're destroyed. Now these are best removed with an impact, like an actual impact screwdriver. And I could have sworn that I brought one up here with me, and I can't seem to find it right now. So thankfully I didn't go crazy tight with it when I went back on. Now I'm fairly certain that you can find these countersunk, I don't know what these would be, maybe a 5/8 bolt with an Allen head in the center of them that would be 1,000 times easier to get on and off of here. And I don't know if technology's come any farther on these things since 1969, but I'm sure they use something better. If not, I'll be really surprised. This thing is a little bit heavy. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's got to be a good 50, 60 pounds. Okay. So this is the unit in question right here. This is the front hub. This mounts onto the spindle with a double nut system and a washer in the middle of the two. And then there's a retainer that goes on the outside to keep everything from backing off. Inside of here there are two tapered roller bearings. There's a large one at the back side that carries the bulk of the weight, and one on the outside as well. There's tension set between those two bearings that preload your bearings and allow this bus to go down the road properly. Now there is a way to check all of that. If you put a dial indicator on the end of the spindle and you rock the spindle back and forth, you should have between 1 and 5/1000ths of an inch of play. And that is a properly set bearing. Now this one I just assembled with just a real light coat of grease because I knew I was going to be disassembling it again. When I took it apart in the first place, I kid you not, there was probably an entire tub of grease inside of here. It was absolutely nuts. Oh my god, you guys have got to see this. What in the world is that? I can tell you this neighborhood is full of surprises, especially when you're near the playa where they hold Burning Man. That car is covered in fur and looks like a rabbit. You never know what you're gonna see around here. Okay, now that we've seen the rabbit car, let's get back to work. That was pretty great. So I broke all of these loose. There are 14 millimeter heads on all of these guys. This is the plate that allows you access into your spindle nuts. And there we are. And you can see just how aggressively chewed up this spindle nut is. I do have a brand new set of spindle nuts that will be going on this bus for final assembly. But for right now, we're just going to chisel this back off here because I do not have the right socket for this. So let me go grab that and we'll get to it. So here is what those are supposed to look like. When we put the good ones on there, I will most definitely buy the correct socket because I don't want it to end up looking like this. But I also completely understand that if you don't have the right tools, you don't have the right tools. So a punch and a big old hammer, and we can break that loose. Now, like I said before, all of this stuff is put together with very light tension. I mean, it's tight, it's not going to come off of there, but I had no intention of driving it in this current state. So that comes off of there. There's a washer with a dimple in it, and then the second washer on the inside here that is just absolutely destroyed. I'll have to try to source one of these. Has a bunch of holes around it. There's a dowel on the inside nut that seats in this. That washer has that dimple that seats in one of these holes, and then you bend the edge of this washer over the outside retaining nut so that everything is retained, nothing's going to back itself off, everything's nice and solid. Now, when I was doing research on this, I found out that like modern day heavy truck hubs are actually preset. They've got a spacer in between the two bearings, which is really unique, and they use a single nut on the outside with a retainer. And I really don't know how I feel about that yet, but I'm on the fence depending on what system I decide to go with. I might stick with the original double nut and washer setup because I think this is just a little bit more solid and there's less of a chance of having a wheel off. Before I get this all the way off, let me go grab a paper towel to set this bearing on. Before I pull this off of here, I just want to verify that the spindle nuts that I bought are the correct thread pitch. There's really no reason why they shouldn't be, but let's just make certain. Oh yeah, look at that. Brand new. Yeah, I don't want to mess those ones up. Okay, so if you've ever seen the roller bearing on the spindle of like a regular passenger car, this is probably going to blow your mind because it's absolutely gigantic. Pop that out like so. And look at the size of that thing. Isn't that crazy? There we are. And the spindle is massive as well. Absolutely massive. Now you can definitely see that there's a little bit of wear on the spindle. It's not bad. I did mic it and it's within maybe 5/10. It's just polished itself a little bit. On the back side here, there's kind of a coating of, I wouldn't say corrosion, maybe surface rust, just a little bit from having a bad seal in the back. It's not too bad. I think with a piece of emery cloth it'll clean up pretty nicely. So I'd like to speak briefly about what my actual goal is today in taking the front end of this bus apart. I'm looking for one critical dimension. I measured every bit of the spindle the last time I had this bus apart. All of the diameters, the tapers, and the lengths from basically the back of the spindle out to each of the different dimensions. And I compared that to a chart of standardized SAE spindles. And I've narrowed it down to one. But there's one critical dimension that I need off of this hub that I didn't have in my notes that I need to figure out, and that is the distance between both of the bearing races. So I'm going to go ahead right now, remove this rear seal, pull the bearing out, clean up as much of the grease as I can, and take that measurement so we can see whether or not an off-the-shelf part is going to work on this spindle. So I'm just using this kind of prying tool here. This is actually how it's recommended to remove these seals. You don't want to hit the bearing out from the inside and push the seal out with it because you can damage the bearing cage. So you're supposed to get in there with this and slowly work that out. And there we go. And now I need another piece of paper towel to set this bearing down on. And this one will blow your mind. It's even bigger than the outside. And look at the size of that. Isn't that ridiculous? Okie dokie. We're basically to the point of no return. This is the make it or break it. It'll either be exactly what I'm hoping it'll be, or it'll be just far enough off to not work. Oh, there's still so much old grease left in there, it's pretty gross. Get right underneath that seat where that race presses down into. Try to get as accurate of a measurement as we possibly can. I mean, these bearing races are just so massive, it is unbelievable. If you want a size reference, I can take my entire arm with a fist and pass it all the way through everything without really hitting anything. Let me flip this over the other way. Get in here and clean out this side as well. Now the reason I'm so convinced this is going to work is because I actually have the booklet for this book, like an entire parts catalog. And on the cover of the parts catalog is a 3301 with 10 lug wheels on it. So I know that the parts exist, and I'm almost completely certain that the spindles from or the hubs rather, from a larger new look would work on this bus. But I think it's almost easier and probably more price conscious to go ahead and find something off the shelf that'll work on this, rather than trying to source, you know, a new look that somebody's trying to part out. So I think for the most part, they're either sitting in a field someplace and they're too far gone, or somebody's doing a full restoration on it and they definitely don't want to sell you the parts off of it. There is the lovely view down into the belly of the beast. Now the dimension that I'm looking for is from this surface back here, right inside this inner lip, to this surface right in here. You can't really, hard for me to point in there in front of the camera, but basically from the back of this bearing race to the front of that bearing race. Thankfully I can snake these right down in here. I can almost get a straight shot from one end to the other. Okay, so I'm going to try to just snake that back out of there ever so carefully and see what that dimension is. So we're looking at 3-inch, 360 thousandths, just about, which I believe is a little bit longer than the standard length that I'm looking for. So that means I'm going to have to continue with the research and see if something off the shelf is actually going to work in this case. So let's talk about my findings, because I think this is really interesting. If anybody else is in the market of trying to convert a vehicle over from 6 to 10 lug, this might be really useful information, and it might absolutely not be, depending on what you have. But this bus utilizes a 1960s Rockwell front axle, which utilizes Rockwell spindles. Now, I wanted to convert this bus over to 10 lug front hubs, and I want to be able to buy either an off-the-shelf part or an off-the-shelf part that I have to modify very slightly. I wanted to do almost no work to it. That way, if anything ever breaks or we're on the road and something goes wrong, I know exactly what to order. We can almost get there, but we're going to have to do just a little bit of work. So I purchased information from SAE about the standardization for heavy truck and bus spindles, because I'm an absolute nerd like that, but also because I absolutely needed the information, and I couldn't find it anywhere online. The spindle that's on the bus is incredibly close dimensionally to an SAE type FF front spindle. So the outer dimension, or not the outer dimension, I'm sorry, the outer bearing, the dimension for the spindle at the outer bearing is identical. It's 1 3/4 inches. The distance between the two bearing cups on the spindle that I have on the bench and an FF spindle, after doing a little bit more research last night, it depends on how the manufacturer lists the dimension. They'll either list it as 3 inches or they'll list it as 3-inch 380 thousandths. So I'm fairly certain that 3-inch 380 thousandths is the actual proper dimension for that, which means that we have basically identical hubs, which is great. The only difference is that the back bearing dimension is totally different. So the spindle that's on the bus, the dimension of the spindle where the inner bearing goes on is 2 1/4 inches. Now the FF spindles use a standard bearing across the entire lineup of FF spindles across any manufacturer, and the spindle dimension there is 2 5/8. So there's quite a bit of difference there. Now, I went down an absolute rabbit hole last night trying to research parts that I could make work together, and I actually found something that I think will work. So on an FF hub, obviously 2 5/8 ID of the bearing so that it goes onto the spindle. And then we have the dimension for the outside of the bearing cup, or the bearing race. And the standardized FF spindle uses a bearing cup with an outer dimension of 4 13/16 inches. I found a bearing that has a very similar load rating. In fact, it's actually a little bit better than the standard bearings for the FF spindle, that has a 2 1/4 inch ID, and the OD of the bearing race is 4 7/8 inches. So we're looking at a difference from one bearing race to the next of 62.5 thousandths. So what that means is basically, if I was to take this spindle, chuck it up in the mill, and machine basically the pocket where that back race goes in, we would only have to take basically 31 1/4 thousandths off of the entire diameter of that hole where the bearing race goes. I don't think that's going to affect structural integrity at all. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and order a hub. I mean, there's so many manufacturers, so many different styles. So obviously it's going to be an FF hub, but it depends on whether it's going to be aluminum or iron or what I decide to go with. There's, I mean, very, very slight design differences from manufacturer to manufacturer, but I need to just nail one down and go with it, get it in my hands, and do the machine work and make sure everything fits. So that basically concludes part 1 of the 10-lug conversion video series. I'm sorry if it was a long one. There's a lot of information in this, and it might not be what you're used to watching on this channel, but I think we're heading in the right direction finally. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.